Hello friends, welcome. Friends, today we are going to talk about satellite spectrum assignment strategy. Now friends, why I am doing this video? The reason I am doing this video is because of the electoral bond issue leading to doubts in the minds of the people about assignment of satellite spectrum to Bharti on an administrative basis, as well as the change of rules in the Telecom bill, which has created a possibility of assignment of satellite spectrum on an administrative basis. Now, the question should be clearly in the minds of the people who are watching this video. If terrestrial spectrum can be auctioned, why satellite spectrum has to be given administratively? This is the question that I am going to answer in this video, and therefore this video is going to become very crucial for everybody to understand. Whoever is interested in the telecom sector and who has closely watched the 2G scam and the controversy that got created on account of the assignment of 2G licenses administratively in 2008. Everybody in this country probably knows about the 2G scam and the 1.76 lakh crores of loss to the exchequer, right? So, why there is no loss to the exchequer if the satellite spectrum is given administratively? Or is there a loss? That is the question that we are going to answer in this video. Okay? So, let's go to the next slide. Now friends, in order for me to answer this question, I have to go a little bit in deep dive to make things a little more clear from a technical perspective. Now, you don't have to get overwhelmed by this chart. This chart is actually very simple, and as I take you through this chart, everything will become very clear and crystal clear, and you don't have to be a technologist to understand this chart. Now, if you look at this chart, there are two different blocks here, one on top, another on bottom. The top one is terrestrial spectrum and the bottom one is satellite spectrum. The top one, the terrestrial spectrum, is of width 200 megahertz total from here to here, and the satellite spectrum is of 2000 megahertz from here to here. Now, first question, why terrestrial spectrum is of a lower bandwidth compared to satellite spectrum? The reason the terrestrial spectrum is of a lower bandwidth, it is at a lower frequency band where you can't find enough spectrum. Satellite spectrum is in a higher frequency band where you can find enough spectrum. That's the first reason. Okay. Second reason is that, when you are using terrestrial spectrum, in order for you to cover a certain geography, the radio waves have to travel a certain distance. Now, radio wave cannot travel very large distances in higher frequency. It can only travel large distances lower frequency. So, whenever you are creating a terrestrial network, you have no other option but to be in the lower frequency band. What are the low frequency band? 3.5 gigahertz and below. And the satellite frequencies are very high. It is maybe around 14 gigahertz, sometimes it is at 26 gigahertz, 28 gigahertz band and higher, right? So you can see the difference, 3.5 gigahertz and below, and in some of the terrestrial networks are actually at 800 megahertz, 900 megahertz, whereas satellite spectrum is at very high frequency, therefore you can find these large blocks of spectrum. Okay, so that is the second part, the reason why you have different quantum. Now, if you look at the terrestrial spectrum, you will find that the terrestrial spectrum is broken into chunks. Operator 1, operator 2, operator 3, operator 4. They are exclusively assigned. Unlike in case of satellite spectrum where the spectrum is shared. Okay, that is the third important distinction between terrestrial spectrum and satellite spectrum. Now, why terrestrial spectrum is given in chunks in an exclusive manner and why satellite spectrum is given on a shared basis? This is the next point to discuss. The reason the terrestrial spectrum is given on an exclusive basis then compared to with a shared basis of satellite spectrum is because if terrestrial spectrum is given on a shared basis, the cost of coordination to use that spectrum among multiple players using the same block of spectrum will be so high that the spectrum will become unusable. Point number one. Second point is that if that terrestrial spectrum is utilized by a particular operator exclusively, then that operator can use that full block of spectrum in a most efficient and optimal fashion, right? Whereas in case of satellite spectrum, both these things are not applicable, and let me explain to you why. And in order for me to explain to you why these are not applicable, I need to make you understand how terrestrial spectrum can utilize, a player using a terrestrial spectrum can utilize one single block of spectrum in an exclusive manner in a most efficient way than sharing spectrum with each other. Okay. So for that, I have to go to a different chart. Now, if you look at this chart, you will find that there are two different diagrams here in this chart. One is frequency block not reused. Another is the same frequency block is reused. What does it mean? It means that you have a geography here. You see, this is a geography. And this geography can be hundreds of square kilometers, right? Which is served by a single base station. Now, if I have only one base station serving a geography of hundreds of square kilometers, and I have a block of spectrum, let's say 50 megahertz, right? Let's assume that this block is of 50 megahertz. I'm just making it up. And then I go to this chart and I say 50 megahertz is being served by single base station, let's say around 200 square kilometers. I'm just making it up, making some number. So the capacity of that particular base station will be proportional to the bandwidth that it is being offered to the operator, because he has only 50 megahertz, and then he has to serve all the customers who are located in this area, in maybe 200 square kilometers. So in this 200 square kilometer, let's assume there are 1000 customers. I'm just making it up. Again, I'm making it up. So that 1000 customers are going to use the same bandwidth of 50 megahertz. So 50 megahertz, let's say, is able to generate a bandwidth of 200 MB. So what will happen? That 200 MB bandwidth will now be shared among 1000 customers who are within that particular area. That becomes the first bottleneck. The second bottleneck is what is the second bottleneck? The second bottleneck is the mobile phone's ability to reach to that base station. Now, if you have a mobile phone here, and that mobile phone has got certain power capability, and you are at a distance of, let's say, 100 kilometers from the base station. Now, the mobile phone is receiving transmission from the base station, but it also has to transmit back to the base station, right? So, if it has to transmit back to the base station, it has to transmit at a very high power in order to cover that distance of 100 kilometers, right? So, your battery will drain. Therefore, you can't have a cell of such a large size for terrestrial network. So what do? You break the cell into multiple smaller cells. So it serves two purposes. One is that you have now what? A limited area to cover with a block of 50 megahertz. So that 50 megahertz, which was currently being shared by how many subscribers I said? Maybe 1000 subscribers. Now 100 subscribers is now sharing that 50 megahertz. Therefore, the bandwidth that a particular subscriber will get will be much higher than sharing 50 megahertz among 1000 subscribers. He will be able to get 10 times the bandwidth. So geographically, you are segmenting and creating more capacity. So that is how this is called frequency reuse, which is possible in case of terrestrial network in a more efficient way, because it is using lower frequency. It can have better coverage. As I told you, lower frequency travel much farther. It has got better coverage, and you can segment the cells into smaller size, and you can harness more capacity out of the system. And by doing this, you are efficiently utilizing that 50 megahertz in a most optimal fashion rather than doing sharing. Because if you do sharing, what will happen? You will put multiple base stations here, and because of the limitation of having a smaller cell size, everybody will start to collide with each other because they are using the spectrum continuously. So it's not that they are using the spectrum sparingly, because these customers are going to be, everybody's customers are going to be located in each and every cell site simultaneously. So everybody will simultaneously transmit, and they will collide with each other and will drive the capacity down. Now come to the satellite spectrum, and why satellite spectrum is always shared. The first reason why satellite spectrum is always shared is because the number of satellites hanging in the sky is low. You see, compared to terrestrial, if you see that India's terrestrial base stations are today 26 lakhs versus towers are 7.6 lakhs. And the Starlink's plan in future is only 42k satellites worldwide. So you have number of satellites pretty low compared to what you have in case of terrestrial base stations. And then the other players like OneWeb, their plans are also, they're pretty low compared to Starlink. So this is the maximum threshold, 42k based satellites. Because the number of satellites are low, therefore in India, let's assume that India is getting served by Starlink satellite. There may not be more than 20-30 satellites on the sky simultaneously versus 7.6 base stations. So what you have to do is that you have to keep the footprint pretty high. So if you look at this chart, you'll find that this is a picture of GSO and NGSO. And GSO means geostationary satellite, and NGSO means non-geostationary satellite. Now Starlink and OneWeb are non-geostationary satellite because they need to make broadband services and have low latency, because higher the orbital length, more the latency, because the speed of light is fixed. So if you have a lower length, which is around 500 to 600 kilometers, sometimes 1000 kilometers versus 36,000 kilometers, your latency is 136th or 140th time compared to a geostationary satellite. And you need lower latency in order to do many applications. Now, if you look at this satellite, even 1000 kilometers or maybe 500 or 600 kilometers will result in a very large footprint. And if the number of NGSO satellite hanging on the sky on India simultaneously is much lower than the total number of base station, this footprint has to be pretty large. And now if you have a very large footprint, as I told you, if you look at this particular diagram when we started with, this is almost like this diagram, right? This is the diagram where you are covering, let's say, 200 or 500 square kilometers using one particular beam emanating from the satellite. Now you may say that you can't do so in case of terrestrial, but how we are able to do in case of satellite? The reason we are able to do it in case of satellite is that the satellite terminals are fixed terminals, and they are powered by a fixed power point which is located in the house. They are not powered by mobile battery, and they are fixed terminals which are pointed to the satellites, and therefore this problem of mobile phone transmitting back to the base station and needing to have more power is not there, because satellites, the terminals are already powered using live power which you have. Therefore, your ability to reach the satellite is not a problem, right? And because of the constraint that you have got limited number of satellites hanging in the sky, you need to cover large bandwidth. And that is why this frequency reuse, which I spoke about in case of terrestrial, is not possible in the same way which satellite players for satellite players. So what happens is that because of this, you can't do frequency reuse. You end up, being in the same block of spectrum, simultaneously by many satellite players. And even with all satellite players put together, this block of spectrum of 200 megahertz can't be used efficiently. You will have capacity, almost 90% of the capacity will be left out unused. Now what will happen is that if you, as I told you, if you break this into blocks, into smaller blocks, then your throughput decreases. Now what happens is that 200 megahertz, let's say, result in 1 gigabit of data. Now that 1 gigabit of data can be shared within this 1,000 customers, or maybe 1 lakh customers, how many customers that in some geography. So that is being shared. Now if you restrict it to 1/4, then these customers, which within this particular geography, will not be able to get a proper speed, because now they will have 1/4 the bandwidth. Okay. So therefore what happens is that because there is no limitation on the capacity that the satellites have, because of very low number of satellites using the geography, then you have a very large footprint. And then because the satellites are spaced apart, they generally don't collide. And if there is a collision of RF signals, there are mitigation techniques which are used. And since these satellites are always moving in the sky, unlike in case of base station which is fixed, these collisions between multiple satellite players are going to be pretty limited, and they can be very easily managed. So there is no loss of quality because of collision in the sky. And then you cannot have multiple number of satellite players. You cannot have like 20, 30 satellite players. Why? Because of the orbital slot limitation. Because that becomes the problem. Because ITU will allocate satellite orbital positions, and these satellite orbital positions cannot be unlimited in number, because these orbital locations have to be separated out from different other satellites, because they should not collide with each other. So because of that hard limitation of orbital slot for non-geostationary satellite, you cannot have unlimited number of satellites. Therefore, this capacity of 2000 megahertz or whatever capacity that you have remains largely underutilized. Now, let me ask you this question. The spectrum for satellite is underutilized to the extent of sometimes 90%. Now, if there is a 90% underutilization spectrum, and then the number of players are also limited. So, where is the demand and supply equation here? Demand is very huge, supply is demand is very low, supply is very, very large. So, in this situation, if you have auction, then what is the mechanism that you have to undertake in order to do auction? You have to limit the number of players to participate in the auction in order to unlock value. If you have unlimited number of players participating in auction, then the auction is going to be a reserve price. Right? So in order to unlock the value, you have to limit the number of players. Let's say if you limit the number of players to, let's say, 4, and those 4 players are participating in the auction. Now, as I told you, this is not going to be a frequency auction, because everybody is going to be sharing the same frequency. So it becomes a license auction. So what does the license auction mean? What is the value emanating out of the license? The value emanating out of the license is the ability of the satellite players to access the market. Now, if the market size, let's say, is X, and if there are 4 players, assume that everybody gets 25% access to the market. So he will be able to create a understanding based on a business case that, look, my license should be valued at this level, this number, let's say, whatever the number is, let's say 100. Now, tomorrow, the government comes out with a new auction in next 2 years time frame. As soon as a new auction is held, it is not a spectrum auction, by the way, because of the reason I explained. Now, that auction is going to do what? It is going to impact the earlier operators who have bid on a certain value of 100, because it is going to neutralize his value or diminish his value from a level 100 to something below, because now the market is going to be divided between how many players now? Let's say 2 players enter next. It will be 6 players now instead of 4 players. So everybody will get a smaller pie of the market than what they were targeting for initially. So in case of satellite, because of this reason, auctioning satellite spectrum makes no sense. So what are the other options available? Administrative assignment. But can you, through an administrative assignment, follow the same transparency requirement which the Supreme Court stated in 2012? That is, it can't be arbitrary. It has to be open. It has to be advertised. You can do so. How you can do so? Because here the demand-supply equation is in favor of supply. So supply is ample, demand is low. So if you are sitting with ample supply, and if you have players coming in and joining your show and wanting to access your commodity with amples of supply, then why you want to limit it? You can have a clear-cut policy, advertised policy, well in the public domain in advance, saying that these are the criteria you have to meet, these are the license fee you have to pay, and if you meet these license conditions, you will be allowed to enter the market. Right? Simple as that. It will be an open, transparent mechanism for assignment of spectrum rather than going through the auction process. You have to go through the auction process if the supply is less, demand is high, which is not the case even today with terrestrial spectrum. If you'll see that, most of the terrestrial spectrum, when sold through auction, is sold at reserve price, and with 60 to 70%, sometimes 100% of spectrum lying unsold. So you can still have a transparent way of mechanism of assignment of spectrum going through the administrative process without violating any of the condition of the Supreme Court judgment. You get it? So that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. Why auctioning of satellite spectrum is going to lead to not a desirable result which you want to achieve. And it is not a loss to the exchequer. right? And what we have already seen, I have done a video to explain that why Supreme Court judgment of 2012 with the cancellation of license, where it stated that spectrum should be given only through auction, is being distorted by vested interest and with people who do not have understanding of this subject. So it is not against the Supreme Court judgment, because Supreme Court clearly said that the value of the commodity only emanates out of the supply and demand equation. If supply is going to be ample enough and if the demand is going to be less, you can still have a mechanism to assign resources, natural resources, administratively following a transparent process where the discretion that the government holds for assignment of resources should be zero. It should be clearly spelled out that these are the rules, nobody can change these rules, and if you follow these rules, I am going to give you resources. You have to spell it out clearly. If you don't spell those rules clearly of administrative assignment, then you will violate the Supreme Court judgment. Okay? Thank you. I'm sorry, I became a little bit excited. Some people complain that my voice gets a little higher because of my sentiment and my close attachment to the subject. Not that, I'm trying to do anything otherwise, right? So I feel very much sentimentally attached because I have seen this space for such a long period of time and get very unhappy with the situation on ground and some of the basic tenets of auctioning and administrative assignment is getting inadvertently not being followed. Thank you very much for your time. I'll come back to you with the next video next time. Thank you very much.